Okay, so we've just had a great discussion that actually set all of this up, which is all a long-winded way of saying, the price of oil is probably on the rise. And if you look at what the IEA, the EIA, or CIRA would have to say about it, and keep in mind, they are historically underestimating price in a backwards-looking fashion, meaning when someone asked a question about if you look back at projections, how often are they accurate, it turns out about 90% of the time we've underestimated the average price of oil in a subsequent decade. But nevertheless, if you look at both conservative, internal, and reference cases, most of these agencies agree that in the year 2030, we are talking about $200 oil in nominal terms. So what does that mean? Well, to explain the implication of that, I want to walk you through a concept that for many of you may be very familiar, but for some of you won't be, so it's worth spending a moment on this. It's something called the oil burden. And if you like to read the writings of oil economists, you'll find yourself familiar with this. In fact, where we sit here on this campus at UCSD is home to a great oil economist by the name of James Hamilton. And anytime he'll tolerate me, I'll take him out to lunch and pick his brain incessantly. And in fact, James Hamilton wrote a great paper on this topic, along with a number of other economists, which is, if you take a look at the oil burden, which is defined as the amount of money that any given country spends on oil divided by their GDP, you get a percentage. When that percentage is above 4, economies tend to stumble. So let me give you an example of this, looking at the world's economy. The green line shows you worldwide demand for oil. And as I said, this is largely a monotonically increasing function with a couple of spits and spats, right? So you had the OPEC embargo, you had the Iranian revolution, and you had the mortgage meltdown. But more or less, oil is growing, worldwide demand. The red line is global GDP converted to US dollars. And you can see that today we're at about $60 trillion. And the blue line is the ratio of those two, which is that oil burden as a percent. Now the dotted line I've put in here is where 4% would sit. So you can see that we've had periods where that oil burden has been more, meaning anytime you're above that dotted line, that's a period of time when the world as a whole has been spending more than 4% of its GDP on oil. Now, I'm not talking about gas, I'm not talking about coal, I'm not talking about any other source of energy other than the liquid petroleum. And you can see that during those times, there's at the very least a correlation with a sluggish economy. Conversely, when you look at periods of time where the oil burden has been low, such as the bull market of sort of the mid-'80s to the mid-2000s, we see significant rise in the global economy. Now, we could sit here and argue all day whether this is causal or just correlated. I just want to point it out that at the very least, there's reason to suspect that when oil prices are high, economies falter. So let's do some math. And again, let's take a look at a conservative forecast, which is IEA. In 2030, the IEA projects that the price of a barrel of oil is $196, and we'll be using 104 million of them a day, which means we'll be spending 7.4 trillion US dollars on oil. If we want an oil burden at